For many years, Goldie Hawn stayed completely silent. No frustrated interviews, no public complaints, no little sarcastic comments hidden inside jokes, just silence. While rumors and stories about Hollywood relationships and power games kept swirling around, Goldie picked the quietest road she could. She said nothing. And in a world where almost everyone is fighting to be heard, that silence slowly became part of who she was in the public's eyes. Until now. In a very low-key, almost ordinary moment, she finally spoke about Rob Reiner. There was no big press event, no furious speech, no tears. Just calm, straightforward honesty. And that quiet honesty hit much harder than any loud outburst ever could. People weren't shocked by the words themselves. They were shocked by the way she said them. Goldie didn't point fingers. She didn't attack anyone. She didn't try to change the past. She simply described what it actually felt like to create alongside Rob Reiner. And that gentle, honest description carried more weight than any angry rant possibly could. She explained that working with Rob was never about huge fights or loud disagreements. No one was yelling. No big ego battles were exploding in front of everyone. From the outside, everything looked polite, professional, and perfectly fine. But underneath that calm surface, something quieter and harder to name was taking place. Goldie didn't talk about one single terrible moment. She talked about an atmosphere, a feeling that built up slowly. She said Rob had this natural, strong confidence that seemed to fill every room he walked into. His thoughts automatically became the starting point of every discussion. His ideas very quickly turned into the path the whole project followed. And little by little, without even fully noticing it at first, she started changing her own behavior to fit around him. She spoke up a bit less. She softened her suggestions. She held back opinions she used to share freely. Not because she agreed with everything he said, not because she was scared of him, but because, after a while, speaking up just started to feel useless. That part surprised a lot of people. Goldie wasn't calling Rob a bad guy. She wasn't describing him as mean or controlling. What she was actually showing was something more complicated and more real. How strong confidence and quiet authority can quietly shape everything in a room, without anyone ever saying out loud that it's happening. For years, she told herself this feeling was normal, and just part of the business. Just how things work in Hollywood. Only now, looking back with clear eyes, did she really see how much that invisible dynamic had affected her. And with one calm, honest reflection, Goldie Hawn quietly opened a door she had kept closed for decades. From the very beginning, Goldie Hawn made one thing very clear. Working with Rob Reiner was never openly difficult. There were no shouting matches, no big dramatic arguments. No one ever stormed out of a meeting in anger. On the surface, everything looked completely normal. Professional, calm, and respectful. But what Goldie described was something much quieter and more subtle. She said Rob had this kind of presence that would change the energy in any room the moment he walked in. As soon as he started speaking, the whole conversation would naturally start moving in his direction. Ideas would slowly begin to line up with his point of view. He didn't have to force it. He didn't demand it. It was just pure, steady, unshakable confidence. And over time, that confidence quietly became the center that everyone else started orbiting around. Goldie explained that at first, she actually admired it. She saw Rob as a strong, clear leader, someone who knew exactly what he wanted and how to make it happen. In creative work, that kind of certainty can feel comforting. It speeds up decisions. It keeps the project moving forward. It brings order to what can often feel like total chaos. But little by little, she started noticing a change happening inside herself. Without even realizing it at first, she began adjusting. When Rob spoke with complete certainty, she hesitated before offering a different opinion. When he pushed an idea forward, she found herself stepping back instead of stepping up. When conversations moved fast in his direction, she let her own thoughts quietly slip into the background. Not because she had nothing to contribute, not because she didn't have good ideas, but because, after a while, pushing against that strong, steady energy just started to feel unnecessary, almost awkward. Goldie later said the change was so gradual, she didn't even notice it happening in the moment. There was never one big moment where she decided, okay, I'm going to stay quiet now. It happened slowly, meeting after meeting, small moment after small moment. She described it as shrinking without noticing, like the room itself was gently guiding her into taking up less space. And what made it even harder to recognize was how polite everything stayed. Rob never raised his voice. He never directly shut her down. He never told her to be quiet. He simply moved forward with such calm confidence that disagreeing with him began to feel more like an interruption than a valuable contribution. And then Goldie realized it wasn't just her. Other people in the room were doing the same thing, nodding along, adjusting their own opinions, letting Rob's vision quietly become the default plan for everyone. It wasn't fear that was shaping those rooms, it was momentum. A powerful, natural momentum created by one very strong presence that almost no one ever thought to question. Looking back now, Goldie says that was the real beginning, the start of a dynamic she didn't fully understand at the time, but one that would quietly shape her entire experience working with Rob Reiner for years to come. As Goldie Hawn started opening up more, she was very careful to make one thing completely clear. She never said Rob Reiner treated her badly. She never claimed he disrespected her. She never pointed to any moment where he openly shut her down or dismissed her. And yet, somehow, she still didn't feel heard. That was the part that confused even her for a very long time. Goldie explained that the issue was never about rejection. Her ideas weren't laughed at. They weren't rudely pushed aside. No one ever told her to be quiet. No one ever said she was wrong. Instead, something much quieter kept happening. Whenever she offered a thought or a suggestion, it would be politely acknowledged, but then it would gently be reshaped. Her ideas would be redirected, reframed, or quietly folded into Rob's bigger picture. The conversation would keep moving forward, but almost never in the direction she had pictured in her mind. On the surface, it all looked like real collaboration. Everyone was being nice, everyone was being professional. But inside those moments, Goldie slowly started to feel smaller. She said this emotional effect was actually much harder to explain than any loud argument or obvious fight. If someone insults you or attacks your idea, you can at least point to that exact moment and say, that wasn't fair. But when you're overlooked in the most polite, professional way possible, it becomes almost impossible to put into words. Over time, she began to feel that her voice simply didn't carry the same weight she thought it should. At her level, with all her experience and success, she expected to be treated as an equal creative partner. Instead, she more and more felt like someone being gently guided, rather than someone whose voice was truly being listened to. What surprised people who heard her speak wasn't anything dramatic that Rob had done. It was what Goldie herself had felt. For the first time, she openly admitted that being in the same creative space as Rob often left her with a quiet, uncomfortable feeling, something she couldn't quite name back then. A sense of being subtly managed, rather than genuinely included. And because nothing loud or obvious ever happened, she kept telling herself the problem must be with her. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe this was just how big Hollywood projects worked. For years, she accepted that explanation and stayed quiet. Now, looking back, Goldie says that was the hardest part to understand and accept. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. The room stayed calm. The conversations stayed polite. The work got finished, but emotionally, she would walk out of those rooms feeling just a little bit smaller than when she walked in. That difference between what was intended and what was actually felt became the heart of everything she's been reflecting on. She came to realize something very important. Power doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it whispers so softly that even the person being affected doesn't fully notice what's happening in the moment, and it was exactly that quiet, honest truth that made her story touch so many people so deeply when they finally heard it. Yeah, Goldie Hawn says she can now trace everything back to one specific moment. At the time, it didn't feel important. There was no drama, no argument, no tension, just a normal creative meeting, like dozens before it. But years later, she realized that was where the pattern quietly began. She described sitting in a room full of talented people, discussing ideas for a project. Everyone was talking, sharing thoughts, offering suggestions. Then Rob Reiner spoke with his usual confidence and clarity. He laid out his vision. He organized the conversation. He moved the discussion forward effortlessly. Goldie remembers watching how naturally the room followed him. Ideas that had been floating around suddenly reshaped themselves around his perspective. Conversations sped up. Decisions began forming before anyone else had fully finished their thoughts. At the time, she called it leadership. She admired how decisive he was. She told herself this was how strong directors worked: clear, focused, certain. But something about that moment stayed with her. She noticed that after Rob spoke, her own ideas landed differently. Not rejected outright, but gently redirected. Suggestions she made were absorbed into his framework rather than explored on their own. She remembers nodding along, telling herself it wasn't worth slowing things down. Everyone seemed comfortable. The project was moving. Why create friction? So she stayed quiet. That was the first time she chose silence instead of speaking up, and she didn't even realize she was doing it. Goldie later admitted that what made it so confusing was how polite everything felt. Rob never interrupted her rudely. He never dismissed her with harsh words. He simply moved forward with such certainty that pushing back seemed unnecessary, almost rude. Looking back now, she sees that moment as the beginning of something much bigger, a small shift in behavior that slowly became a habit. The first time she stepped back instead of leaning in, she didn't feel angry, she didn't feel mistreated, she just felt smaller. And instead of questioning the environment, she questioned herself. Was she being too sensitive? Was she reading too much into nothing? Was this just part of professional collaboration? Those questions kept her quiet. What felt like a single, harmless meeting eventually turned into a repeated pattern. Each time Rob's confidence filled the room, she learned to adjust a little more. That first uncomfortable moment didn't change everything at once, but it quietly set the tone for everything that followed. After that first meeting, something subtle began to change inside Goldie Hawn. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a quiet shift in how she saw herself. Instead of questioning Rob Reiner's dominance in the room, she started questioning her own reactions to it. Whenever she felt unheard, her first instinct wasn't to wonder why. It was to assume the problem must be with her. Maybe I didn't explain my idea clearly enough. Maybe I'm being too emotional. Maybe I'm not seeing the bigger picture. That became her inner dialogue. Rob's confidence felt so natural, so accepted, that challenging it almost seemed unreasonable. When someone speaks with certainty and everyone else follows, it's easy to assume they must be right. And Goldie slowly fell into that trap. She convinced herself that staying quiet was professionalism, that stepping back was maturity, that letting things slide was simply part of being easy to work with. In her mind, she wasn't shrinking. She was collaborating. But deep down, something didn't feel right. There were moments when she almost spoke up, when she nearly pushed back on a decision, when she felt strongly enough to say, I don't agree. Yet time after time, she stopped herself. Not out of fear, but out of a growing belief that her voice simply wouldn't change anything. Goldie later admitted that this was the most dangerous part of the dynamic. Rob never had to silence her. She began doing it to herself. His certainty became the standard. Her hesitation became the flaw. And the more this happened, the more natural it felt. What made it even harder to recognize was how pleasant everything remained on the surface. There were no hard feelings, no obvious conflicts, no moments that demanded confrontation. So she kept telling herself the same story. This is normal. This is how creative partnerships work. I'm probably overthinking. But over time, that quiet self-doubt began to follow her beyond just meetings with Rob. It shaped how she behaved in other rooms, with other powerful figures, in other projects. The pattern didn't start everywhere. It started here. And Rob Reiner became the first example of something she wouldn't fully understand until many years later. The way confidence, when left unquestioned, can slowly teach others to question themselves instead. As time went on, and the dynamic around Rob Reiner stopped feeling like a single experience and started feeling like a system. Goldie Hawn didn't wake up one day and decide to silence herself. It happened gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. Meeting after meeting, project after project, she began learning the unspoken rules of the room. She learned when it was safe to speak. She learned when her voice would likely be ignored. And most importantly, she learned when staying quiet felt easier than trying to be heard. None of this was ever written down. No one gave her instructions. No one told her to step back. The room itself taught her. Goldie later explained that this was the strangest part. Silence didn't feel forced. It felt practical. It felt efficient. And over time, it even started to feel polite. If Rob had already made up his mind, why slow things down? If everyone else was nodding along, why create tension? If the project was moving forward, why risk being seen as difficult? Those small justifications slowly shaped her behavior. At first, she thought she was simply being professional. She told herself she was choosing harmony over unnecessary conflict, but without noticing, that choice became automatic. The habit of stepping back turned into instinct. Goldie began catching herself mid-sentence, stopping before she even finished her thought. Ideas she once would have spoken out loud stayed locked in her mind. Suggestions she believed in deeply never made it to the table. And the more this happened, the more natural it felt. What made it so confusing was that nothing bad ever seemed to result from her silence. Projects still succeeded. Work still got done. And everyone remained friendly and respectful. So she kept telling herself the same comforting story. If nothing is visibly wrong, then nothing must be wrong. Only years later did she realize the cost of that thinking. Because every time she chose silence, a small part of her confidence faded. Every time she adjusted herself to fit the room, her voice became a little quieter. And every time she accepted being unheard, it became easier to accept it again. Goldie now describes that period as a slow training process. Not a training imposed by Rob, not even a training created intentionally, but a training created by the power of one strong personality and the way others naturally adapted around it. By the time she noticed what was happening, staying quiet no longer felt like a decision. It felt like the correct response. And that realization would eventually force her to look back at everything she had accepted for so long. By the time years had passed, Goldie Hawn no longer saw the situation around Rob Reiner as something external. She began to see it as something wrong within herself. What started as small adjustments slowly turned into deep beliefs about her own voice and value. Rob's confidence felt so natural, so unquestioned, that she began assuming it must always be correct. And if his certainty was right, then her hesitation had to be wrong. That was the quiet conclusion she reached without ever meaning to. Goldie admitted that she started interpreting her own instincts as weaknesses. Whenever she felt unsure, she blamed her sensitivity. Whenever she disagreed internally, she assumed she simply didn't understand the bigger picture. Instead of thinking, "Why am I not being heard?" she thought, "Why am I not expressing myself better?" Instead of wondering if the room needed to change, she believed she needed to change. This internal shift became more powerful than anything Rob ever said or did. Because once a person starts doubting their own voice, no one else needs to silence them anymore. They silence themselves. Goldie later realized how deeply she had absorbed that imbalance. The dynamic she experienced around Rob didn't stay limited to him. It quietly followed her into other professional spaces. Whenever she worked with strong, confident personalities, she found herself repeating the same pattern, holding back, adjusting, softening her opinions, stepping aside. Rob Reiner had simply been the first place where she noticed it clearly. At the time, she never described it as unfair. She never called it uncomfortable. She never labeled it as a problem. She called it professionalism. She called it collaboration. She called it being easy to work with. Only much later did she understand what was really happening. Goldie began to see that she had traded something important for peace. She had exchanged honest expression for smooth meetings. She had chosen harmony over authenticity, again and again, without realizing the long-term effect. And the more she reflected on it, the more she understood a painful truth. The imbalance she felt wasn't just created by Rob's presence. It was completed by her own silence. That realization didn't make her angry, it made her aware. For the first time, she could look back and recognize how easily a strong environment can reshape a person from the inside out. What unsettled her most was this simple fact. No one had forced her to shrink. She had learned to do it on her own. And that lesson, she says, stayed with her for far longer than any single project or meeting ever did. For a long time, Goldie Hawn believed that staying quiet was the smartest choice. She had learned to adapt, to adjust, to step back when necessary. Silence had become comfortable, safe, predictable. But eventually, there came a moment when she decided to break that pattern. It wasn't a dramatic scene. There were no raised voices, no emotional confrontation, just a regular creative discussion like so many before. During one particular meeting, Rob Reiner presented an idea he was clearly set on. The room responded in its usual way. People nodded, conversations moved forward, and the direction began forming almost instantly. This time, Goldie felt differently. Instead of letting her thoughts fade, she chose to speak. Calmly and professionally, she offered another perspective. She explained why she saw things differently. She suggested an alternative approach. Nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational, just honest disagreement. For a brief moment, she felt relieved. She had finally used her voice instead of holding it back. Rob listened. He responded politely. He restated his own position. And then, just as smoothly, he continued forward as if her objection had already been resolved. The meeting ended quickly after that. The original decision remained unchanged. No one returned to her point. No one reopened the discussion. And on the surface, everything stayed calm and respectful. But something important had shifted. What stayed with Goldie wasn't losing the argument. She understood that disagreements happen in creative work all the time. That wasn't the issue. What stayed with her was what happened afterward. In the days and weeks that followed, she noticed small changes. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just subtle differences. Fewer moments where she was asked for early input. Fewer check-ins about decisions. A slight distance she couldn't quite name. She was still included, still respected, still part of the process, but no longer at the center of it. That single moment of speaking up had quietly shown her where the invisible boundaries were. It revealed how much influence she truly had, and how easily that influence could be reduced. Goldie says that was when she fully understood something important. Speaking up didn't create chaos, but it did change access. And once she saw that, she became even more careful with her words. Not because she doubted herself, but because she now understood the unspoken cost of challenging a powerful presence. Looking back, she calls that day the turning point. It was the first time she realized her silence hadn't been accidental. It had been learned, and now she knew exactly why.